Good evening. I'm Mark Harris. Welcome to DiversiTV, DiversiTV Season 3. Welcome if this is your first time here. Welcome back if you're part of our growing legion of followers. And that almost sounds like it's a cult, but okay. We're not exactly a cult, but we have been getting good feedback. If you're just tuning in, DiversiTV's mission, if you could go to slide, gentlemen. DiversiTV's mission is to illuminate everyday diversity issues as it's defined at Lane Community College, because that's where we're broadcasting from, and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. Often to that end, one of the things that we look at in terms of putting our schedule is we often go with almost a food group approach. I can be a little bit irreverent having been in the field for a long time. Familiarity doesn't necessarily breed just contempt, but it does bring a certain comfortable where you can at least bring a little sense of humor. So because I'm a black Indian, and one of the things that we like to do traditionally is give reverence to those whose ground we're on. We always start with Native, and we did. An Anglo perspective, then African Americans in Eugene. February 6th, we did a Latino perspective. 13th, last week, we did a Longhouse perspective. And this week, we're doing a Pan-Asian perspective, because within each one of these rubrics, for example, Asian, well, what does that mean? And our guest and I will be talking about that, among other things. Next week, I had an opportunity, and I jumped on it, to bring in a member of one of the so-called black pioneer families. And so we'll be talking with that individual next week. March 5th, we'll be having a youth perspective. March 12th, class perspective, and then ending this season with spirituality and religion. Last time we looked at that, we were looking at Native American spirituality, which doesn't necessarily get the same standing as, say, the Catholic Church. But our guests had talked about what, the special problems in terms of dealing with that. We might reprise that conversation or move on to another group that often gets short shrift too. Tonight, Surendra Subranrani, who is the UVO College of Education Diversity Coordinator and a faculty member. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark, for having me.
Good to see you, because I've always wanted to have this conversation, not necessarily on camera, but where are you from?
As it is pretty obvious, I am of Indian, as in East Indian ethnic origin, but I am the 5th generation born in Singapore.
Okay.
And grew up there, came to the U of O as an undergrad, and then I migrated to Australia. So now I'm an Australian. And then came back, did my master's at OSU, and then did my PhD here at the U of O, and then got a job at the University of Oregon, and currently teaching and coordinating at the College of Education. So it's been a long ride from across the Pacific over here.
So what classes do you teach, and what are your degrees in?
It's quite strange, because my undergraduate degree, I've got two. One is in finance and the other one is in economics. And before coming here as an undergrad, I had worked in Singapore for a period of 6.5 years as an audit clerk with Ernst & Whinney, which then became Ernst & Young.
Right.
And in the capacity of an audit clerk, I did audits in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and as well as in Brunei Shell Petroleum in Brunei. Then coming over here, did my undergraduate in business, and then migrated to Australia, and I was the assistant auditor in the Auditor General's office in New South Wales. Then became internal auditor in the Department of Corrective Services, overseeing the whole prison system for the state. and then eventually ended up as the senior management auditor for the Department of Lands, and then kind of grew kind of disenchanted or disappointed with the whole auditing and business arena. And I decided basically, let's go deeper into it. Came and applied to to Oregon State University, got my MBA, and that was where it became very clear to me that you can learn all the business acumen that you can, but if you do not have the human touch, if you cannot connect with another person on that fundamental human level with dignity and with respect, you have lost it, basically. And more importantly, losing yourself in the process. So I thought, well, if I get into the business field again, I will be only able to influence a small group of people with whom I work with. But I thought, if I were to get into education, at least I get a chance of contaminating the minds of students term after term. So I decided to do my PhD in education, a total shift.
Yes.
And began to see significant flaws with not only the education system here, but with the education system that I received. Starting off as a British subject in Singapore, and going through the British system in Singapore. And then, when going through some of the education systems around the world, tremendous flaws, because I think all education systems are remnants of a colonial model, a Western model, which could very well be inappropriate, really, for the real development of a particular country.
Yes.
But when education systems were implemented predominantly by the colonizers, they were set up to make clerks out of the locals.
Right.
For the colonial establishment.
Right. British East India Company, among others.
Yes.
You mentioned Brunei Shell,
Yeah.
right, which is Royal Dutch Shell,
Right.
which is,
Right. And in the process, when countries became independent, like Singapore, like India, and so forth, they, for want of a dire need to have an education system, quickly adopted the colonizers' model.
Right.
And in the process, they are still producing clerks.
Yes, essentially.
For this time, it is not the colonizers, but the upper class. So some of the classes that I teach, I'm actually a faculty at the Family and Human Services, and I teach diversity in human services at the undergraduate level, as well as at the graduate level. I teach comparative education, looking at different countries' education systems from a macro perspective, looking at the historical, social, political, economic aspects and how that affects an education system on a national basis. And also I teach the class on educational leadership. Besides that, I've now just been given the position of the diversity coordinator for the College of Ed.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And lots of responsibilities come along with that.
I'll say, since I'm wearing that hat here myself, it's let's say it's interesting. There are some gray hairs beginning to develop and I had brought some to the position, but I don't see that many in yours. It may be okay.
Well,
you'll be all right.
I think having lived out of this country for an extended period of time helped, I think.
Yes. Right.
But I think they are all now coming back.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you come to diversity work, and I guess my first introduction with you was basically as a player in the diversity game, from an content expert point of view, right? And so now that explains some of your educational background and experiential background. What do you see as the flaws? Because quite frankly, one of the things that we're dealing with here in America is that we are dealing with a adaptation of the British educational system.
Right. I wouldn't isolate it particularly to the American system. It is global. Basically, one can say there are three forms of education. One is the French, one is the German, and the other one is the pseudo-British American education system.
Okay.
And almost all countries, almost without exception, follow one or a modified form of this. And part and parcel of the education institution comes the pedagogy of how a subject is to be learned.
Okay.
How, where do you start off from?
Right.
And these have already been predetermined from a colonizer's model.
Yes.
Now, when we look at it from a perspective of a colonizer's model, I mean, it is basically, putting it in very simple terms, looking at the world using the lenses of the colonizer.
Yes.
But then does it mean that, you know, it is appropriate and applicable, directly applicable for the benefit of non-Europeans? And that is where the big problem comes, because from my point of view, I think many of the countries which have remained developing, or what previously was called third world, are left third world.
Slash fourth world.
Fourth world,
Yeah. Right.
Mainly because of an education system which does not really address the true needs of that country or the people. Because most of what we are taught in school, even in Singapore and here in the US, is from a elitist perspective. And I just spent 3 months or 3.5 weeks over in India. And one thing that was very obvious for me when I was relating with a couple of the village development projects among the poor people, that I would have to say almost about every social, political, economic theory that we learn and we teach in institutions of higher learning, you can throw it out of the window because it doesn't apply to 4 billion people on the planet because they are poor.
Right.
And why is that? You see, that is the question I think we should be asking. Why is it that, you know, we, instead of addressing the education of an individual to its fullest extent so that they can be a contributing member to humanity and to the nation, we look at them as human resource, units of labor, you know, where one quantifies them by how much they earn, rather than are they truly one who give themselves to humanity. And that aspect, the intangible aspect, is not valued. And we learn that through an education system. We learn that element of competition at the expense of another. We don't learn how to collaborate together. That is something that is just coming forth. You know, we have various class assignments like, learning how to work in a group. You know, but the thing is, have we really gone deep enough to understand oneself first?
Yes.
Looking at one's own biases and prejudices so that one can then actively engage somebody comfortably without having to be defensive. Because it's quite surprising.
Or fearful, or any number of things.
Yes.
Not dealing from a position of strength or competence. Or,
yes.
Right, yeah.
Because it is quite ironical that here, as with other countries, like in Australia, even in Singapore, you know, we talk about the US being a melting pot. The key question that one should ask is, melting into what? There is a dominant color when you melt various colors together. You know, and here, one of the crucial part is one has got to give up various components of the community has to give up some important aspect of their identity so that they can be included into the mainstream.
Right.
Well, that was exactly how the colonialists set it up.
Right.
You learn English in India or in Singapore or in Malaysia or all the colonies. Even the French and the Dutch did it, you know, in those countries where they colonized. You know, you learn their language, you learn to walk their talk, and then you are deemed successful. Those who could not.
As long as you're a carbon copy of, for example, a British Raj or something like that.
Yes, and that too is dependent upon according to the standards set by them.
Yes. Right.
You know, them meaning the colonizers. Have we really deviated significantly from that ideology? And I would argue no.
Yeah.
Because if this was a melting pot, or for that matter, other countries, even Australia, of which I'm a citizen of, if it is a melting pot, then why do we have to take classes on diversity?
Well, therein lies the rub. Okay, so for example, and I wish I actually had the graphics, because, knowing that we've had this kind of conversation offline.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So as diversity trainers that we are, all right. So the paradigm that where the melting pot idea came from was a Jewish immigrant essentially writing a play around the turn of the century in America and talking about using the industrial model of which, again, teaching in my class is that the word ghetto basically means foundry. It's a Polish word for foundry, 15th century, where Jews were basically confined to this area around, where they're melting metals, smoky, dirty, nobody wants to be there, and it has since become a generic name for any place you put undesirables. Right. So out of that, the melting pot paradigm comes directly from that technology. Right. And the idea, of course, is you're taking all these different groups, and in the flame of American opportunity, because that's the context we're talking about, their differences get melted down and they get poured out into the American mainstream. Right. Problem is, some folks ain't melting. Yep. And will never melt. Right. And, I remember, this African-American young rapper, from LA talking about, I'm the bone in the melting pot that will not melt, refuses to melt. Uh-huh. Because, when we're talking about being poured out into the mainstream, when George Bush, either one of them, Senior or W, talks about mainstream America, it's clear he's talking about Iowa and not South Central, not the Central District of Seattle, right. Not North Portland, right. Not Whitaker. Right. So some of us don't melt. So diversity trainers have basically tried to use other rubrics like, the salad bowl. So right. Whether it's fruit salad or green salad, the common culture is the dressing. And right. Tomatoes remain, you can have several varieties, several different types of lettuce. Carrots remain carrots, though beets can stain carrots and everything else. Right. And it's all nourishing. Right. But that I found actually inadequate to explain other phenomenon where I like to use personally the mimetic paradigm, which a lot of people aren't familiar with memes, but it's like a virus of the mind and it mutates given different environments. Right. So this can explain where Crips and Bloods can suddenly become on a Navajo reservation or American Samoa or Tongan Crips, and they take a different flavor depending on where they are. Yes.
And this aspect is well said when Lee Kuan Yew, who was the Prime Minister of Singapore, they called him the best Englishman east of the Suez. Ooh. Because the thing is, educated in Cambridge, topped Cambridge, in fact. Right. But he had the ability to conduct himself like an Englishman. Better than the English themselves. Mm-hmm. And of course, this endeared him to the, to the upper class. Right. Basically the politicians and stuff over in Whitehall.
Talk about your model minority stereotype there.
But then when he comes over to Singapore, he changes his whole way of speech and talks very much, he speaks English and Mandarin and Malay, but he speaks with a local accent and stuff. But you got to admire the man, regardless of what you think of him. Being able to, traverse two different cultures and be respected on both sides.
Is it only two?
Well, I would say, in England and in Singapore, because I don't think he's that very well respected outside of Singapore. Yeah. They might, give him the respect as having been the former head of state. Mm-hmm. But his political ideologies and stuff does not necessarily vibe with most of the countries in Southeast Asia. But nevertheless, the conditioning of the mind, I think that is where much of our questions need to be asked in terms of diversity, in the sense of, when information is put in, we basically do not question where that information came in, who created it, and, is it apolitical? Is it areligious? And what was its purpose for being devised in that manner? You see, there is a purpose. When you look at it from the perspective of colonized countries, there is a purpose for education structured in a particular way.
Right.
Because then one is able to communicate with the other. I remember...
but the communication is not both ways.
Yes, exactly.
So given that example, all right, so yes, he speaks English, Malay, and Mandarin.
Right.
But would a white man in his position be expected to acquire those languages?
Definitely not.
Okay.
Definitely
so here we come to the rub around cultural competency,
Right.
where people of color are expected to assimilate into the colonizer's model,
Right.
And be able to, we are valued because, you can speak to those folks, et cetera, et cetera. But the system itself does not gain any competency, and so it is a rare person, because again, if we're talking colonization, or we're talking a Western, i.e. white, i.e. European or American model, where the competency doesn't go both ways. The person of color is expected to assimilate to
adapt to
the empire, but the empire does
not have to come down, because mainly there
and
is a
it's
hierarchy.
come down, and they talk about it's coming down to go native, right?
But that is another terminology that it's quite interesting, looking at it from the perspective of anthropology.
Yes.
When a Westerner does research in a non-European, community, culture, or even a village, and after spending many years there, he or she takes on those cultural norms, those mores, and starts dressing like them, eating like them, speaking like them, and completely being one with them. To such an individual, that they are given the term, he or she has gone native.
Yes, right.
But take, for instance, myself, coming from Singapore, coming over, having been, educated in a British system, coming over here to the US, getting all 3 tertiary degrees, that terminology, having gone native, is not used. I have been modernized.
Yes. Modernized. Now here's an interesting thing that I find somewhat amusing, because in our Western system of education, and you are in fact at the College of Education, where history apparently begins at the year 0 Gregorian,
Right.
and nothing happened before
then.
Okay, and history starts in 1492 here on Turtle Island, and nothing happened before that. Okay, so if you identify as East Indian, all right, so wait a minute. There was a complex urban civilization there 3,000 years ago, and remains so. There ain't no white folks, no white Aryans sweeping down from the Khyber Pass, conquering y'all, and then, as the dominant mythology said, and then giving you advanced culture and then disappearing. You had it already.
Yes, precisely. Right now, archaeological evidence is showing that the so-called Indus Valley civilization goes back 9,000 BC.
Okay.
But the thing is, there's also this flawed association of the Aryan race invasion.
Right.
Because the thing is, there never was an Aryan invasion.
No, Arya is Sanskrit for pure. It's a spiritual condition.
A spiritual condition, or what in the Western terminology would be considered as Arthurian, like what King Arthur exhibited. One who is seeks a seeker of knowledge, one who is just, one who is willing to give up his life for the benefit of others.
Okay.
Those are considered as Aryans.
Arya. Okay.
But the thing is, when specifically Germanic researchers in the late 1800s were doing research, they could not come to the realization that here you have got a civilization of dark-skinned people who could live,
Oh,
who could
these
come up
black
with
people could not have done
such
that.
a sophisticated
No way.
civilization.
Yeah.
So they decided to find out what their roots were. And they started looking into the ancient, Indian texts, which are the Vedas and the Upanishads. And they kept coming across this term called the Aryan people. Now, in ancient usage of words, they did not have that vast a vocabulary. And Aryan people is not a reflection to a particular race, but to
Or
a
a
group of
tribal
people.
group.
Yeah, but to a group of people who exhibited certain characteristics within their community.
Okay.
Well, for the Western researcher of the 1800s, who was basically racist,
To put it charitably. Yeah.
who basically felt that these Aryan people must have come from elsewhere.
Yes.
So they felt that they must have been lighter skinned and they came in with chariots and invaded and destroyed these people. And but that wasn't good enough. They must come from further west. So they decided to call them Indo-Aryans, meaning their origin was from Persia. And even that wasn't good enough. All right. Then they decided that you could trace their origins to a place beside a lake in Switzerland, and these are Euro-Aryans. So again,
Excuse me.
Europe civilizes the dark-skinned people. But here's the strange part of it. If there was such an invasion, Dr. Kenoyer, I think he's a archaeological professor from Wisconsin, who's currently doing tremendous amount of excavation in that area. He says there's no archaeological evidence of an invasion.
Right.
And
None at all.
None at all. And what he's beginning to see is the fact that when you look at it from the perspective of mythologies, like take for instance the Jews, the Hebrews, right? Their exodus from Egypt, there's a tremendous story, that has been developed,
Yes.
of their freedom
Right.
out of slavery from
Right.
Egypt.
Right.
Well, if there was an Aryan invasion of the dark-skinned people, and these dark-skinned people were pushed down to the south of India and to the
Dravidians
east,
or whatever, yeah.
there must have been some part of India mythology that says we were coming up from north and we were driven down, and there's practically nil. And when you look at the North Indians, to ask them, if they came from across the Khyber Pass, there must be some mythology there that says that they came from across the mountains. There was none.
Right.
So everything was based on...
But their view isn't taught in
Right.
Germany or England
Right.
or here. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Max Weber, who was a linguist, basically made some word associations and basically said these words must have come to the South Indian continent from elsewhere. But it remains part of the curriculum. It remains
Yes.
part of their whole way
An
of appreciating.
unquestioned part.
Unquestioned
of the curriculum.
part.
Right. Yeah.
But right now, with current archaeology that is going on, it is disproving all that has been developed as part of an academic, exercise. But some of the greatest, I would say, the people who still hang on to that, ironically, are the Indians themselves, who have been colonized, mentally, intellectually
Yes,
colonized.
yes, right.
And here is the big issue. I mean, they have been beaten down, to their knees through this intellectual colonialism and also political and economic colonialism, that right now, for them to stand up and look at their own history objectively, they are unable to do that. And we are talking about the educated. And this is the real tragedy, I think. And this is part of the historical aspect that has got to be considered by every developing nation and looking at their educational system. Why was it set up this way? It is set up this way to show that you people are uncivilized, and because of the civilizing grace that the colonizers have given you, the payment is the resources that you've got to give. And the resources that you have given is still inadequate for the civilizing effect
Right.
of Europe.
Right.
to understand this, and there's a wonderful book written by J.M. Blount, Colonizer's Model of the Mind, which basically explains this whole theory and how it completely dismisses the tremendous contribution that has been given by other civilizations and other peoples.
Right.
Now the question, we have gone into the 21st century. Why can't we look back in history and exactly state that the way of research at that time was very biased and prejudicial, but let's look for the truth. But no, we hang on to that, for so long, right, that it has become truth.
Right. So one question then becomes, well, one of many.
Many.
Okay. I could ask you personally. So where did the decolonization process start with you?
It actually happened to me in Brunei.
Okay.
Was an audit clerk, and for the first time in my life, I saw apartheid being practiced, coming from Singapore, and but they didn't call it apartheid. They call it senior management and junior management. Right?
And the seniors are always white, and the juniors are always of color.
The seniors are always the British and the Dutch, and the juniors are the local people. Now, the local people, accounts clerks, had chartered accountancy degrees, just the same degree taken in England as the financial controllers who came in. But they could never rise up to being the manager or the financial controller.
Because? A flaw in their education?
It was, well, it was basically they were not very competent to run an accounting department, or for that matter, any of the various departments within Shell Petroleum.
Oh, I'm missing something. So they could both be educated in Cambridge by the same professor, acquire the same knowledge. The Asian junior partners could actually excel and be at the top of their class and actually academically succeed farther beyond the capacity of their senior partners, but somehow there's a flaw.
If you're working in that institution that basically is a British-Dutch consortium, it'll always be a British or Dutch who will be above you.
Okay.
So that was one. And then the other aspect...
NASA has to manage the masses.
Yes.
Okay.
And then the other aspect was, for the senior management, they had their club. And it was called the Panaga Club. And we, as visiting auditors, we had passes to both, the senior management club and the junior management's club. And when you went in there, it was you had the royal treatment. It was better than going to some of the five-star hotels. You had waiters dressed up in white uniforms with white towels, and the plates and the forks were shining and laid out in front of you, air-conditioned, swimming pool, well scrubbed, well looked after. And then you went over to the Shell Club, which was for the junior management. And it was one of those colonial buildings, right, which had fans probably about 20 feet high. No doubt the fans were spinning, but I don't think I felt the air come down.
No.
You look at the swimming pool and you had green algae growing along the sides.
Somebody's not keeping up with their chemicals.
Yep, the food that was served. I mean, you this was blatantly obvious, and that started me thinking. And then finally, when I had to, as an audit clerk, I had to go and talk and discuss things with one of the managers of a particular department, and he was English. And every appointment I made with him, he says, "Oh, I've got no time, see me later." And when I did make an appointment, "Oh, I've got no time," and he will keep brushing me off, and I've got a deadline. I've got to get the audit done. Eventually, out of exasperation, I went, after being rejected, I walked straight over to my British audit manager and said, "I've been trying to meet this guy for so long. I just need the documents so that I can do my work. What do what do you do?" Well, he said, "Let me go and have a word with him." And as soon as he walked in and I was peeking in to see what was happening, immediately he had an audience. Sit down, have a cup of tea. What are the documents you want? Gave it to him, and the manager came out and gave it to me so that I can do my work. that was the moment
Bingo.
when I began to realize, am I that much less of a human being than this chap? And all he did was go grab the documents, the same documents that I would have got from him, do my work.
But you see, this person was trained by an educational system that did, in fact,
Perpetuate.
perpetuate that. So let's bring it to America.
Right.
Because here we are, University of Oregon,
Right.
Lane Community College,
Right.
Lane Community College, I'll cap on my organization being, interim chief diversity officer. So we actually, are training people to deal with a global workforce,
Yes.
But, we still have, history classes and other classes where, people are being taught that slavery improved black people by raising them out of savagery in Africa, right? Even though we still have, we have complex urban civilizations going back 10,000 BC,
Yes.
just like the Indus Valley has complex urban civilizations going back 900 BC.
Right.
Who's civilizing who?
Right.
Who's using whose language? So wait a minute here. So people are basically given a certain mythology here, and so you're training teachers at the College of Education and also family, the Family and Human Services Department, to deal with people who are in poverty or not. What is still being taught, and how do you begin to correct some of those flaws?
Well,
here locally.
I mean, for me personally, I always believe that when you are teaching not for the present or for the past. You are teaching for the future. And therefore, the advantage that I have is having lived in 3 continents for an extended period of time. I'm always trying to keep tab with where the rest of the world is heading towards. This country has always kept a very provincial look at itself, and there was a time when it was preeminent.
Yes.
But other countries are catching up, and the other countries which are catching up
surpassing quickly,
or are basically developing countries. And one of the things that I find is the fact that teaching them curriculum in the manner it was meant for the Cold War is not going to help them meet the challenges, the unknown challenges of the 21st century.
Yeah, right.
So what are we actually dealing with, especially with a future that it's unpredictable, it's moving so very quickly? And one of the things that I've come to realize is the fact that you got to teach them a high degree of adaptability, a high degree of critical thinking. Our students here. High degree of critical thinking.
A few languages wouldn't be a bad thing.
A few languages. And it is not just a matter of acquisition of language skills.
Right.
Imagine what language acquisition does to the brain while it is growing. Because that is when the child is 3, 4, 5 years old and is learning to pick up a language, the brain's connection, the cerebral connections, are also being developed. That's the time when you expose that dynamic mind, to various languages, at the same time pushing it forward into various fields, like take for instance what I would call hand-eye coordination classes, like art, music, dance, and also exposing them to the various fields of study like history, geography, mathematics, but in a manner that has got a relevance for the present, where they can see what I'm studying here has got a direct impact on what I'm studying over there. Right. Hypothetically, take for instance, if you're teaching dance, for example, as an educator, I think one should realize, or one should come to that realization, if a child is very interested in dance, how do you infuse history into it? How do you infuse mathematics into it? How do you infuse geography into it? Where it will arouse the child's mind to learn about dances from a historical context, from dances from different cultural perspectives. Because that child, at that time when it is growing, is a sponge.
Right.
It is that the mind that wants to know.
And
it craves
if you format and educate that child correctly, they can remain a sponge.
Remain a sponge. And just to let you know, I mean, in the Sri Aurobindo system of education, which is in a small little school in South India, where I was literally flawed. The children come in at the age of 3 and they are taught Sanskrit, which links them to the language of India.
Right.
At age 5, they are taught French. Now, I'm not a linguist, but what I was told was, if you know French first, it's easier for you to hop into the other European languages.
Yes.
Then at age 7, they are taught English and their mother tongue. So by the time that they are 8 years old, they know how to read, write, and speak 4 languages. Mm-hmm. Then you're given art, music, and dance, for hand-eye coordination. Mm-hmm. And then they go through the various disciplines as we know it. But at the same time, one of the things that really surprised me was they don't have exams per se. The child is allowed to progress at its own speed in the fields that it feels interested in, and the role of the teacher is to provide the other fields of information to the student in a manner which arouses its curiosity. So they have got a system that goes up to the university level, and this is where even the usage of words have been framed through my own indoctrination in this culture, the British as well as the American culture. Like take, for instance, the word concentration. Mm-hmm. I've been trained to believe that concentration means you start focusing on that one aspect. Right. In that school system, when the student is at the time when they are going to graduate from at the university level, one of the rare few tests that they have is the child is asked to play a musical instrument. Let's take, for instance, the drum. And in this case, tabla, which is 2 drums, right, where your hands have got to move in 2 different speeds. Mm-hmm. And in the Indian classical music tradition, you've got the 3 beat to the 106 beat. Mm-hmm. So the lecturer will say, play me the 18.5 beat. So while the child is playing the 18.5 beat and holding that rhythm, there are 3 professors asking questions on 3 different subjects simultaneously. So I began to recognize the limitations of my education system and my interpretation of the word concentration, because in that educational system, which is coming from an ancient education system, they strongly believe that the human brain is capable of multiple concentrations simultaneously.
Multitasking at a level that we're not talking about here when we say
all depends upon the training.
Yes.
And it's not to confine the student to a particular mindset, but to let the child explode.
Yes.
Let the curiosity fly out. Yeah. And that is the energy that is intrinsic in a child that we should be learning to harness. And that we are failing. But in the diversity class that I'm teaching, I'm very, very fortunate, I would say, to be in the midst of students who might start off, ways back and trying to understand diversity. But by the time that they're 10 weeks old, they're beginning to recognize that, I'm learning about, this class is supposed to be on diversity that is out there, but in the final analysis, I'm learning more about myself.
Yes, yes.
That is one of the most important aspects of education. If one does not know what one is, how can you take a journey going in a particular direction when you don't know the source?
And expand that, because as you pointed out, because I can see that visualization of I'm going to pick Kahero just because I know the beats for that. Okay, so left hand's on the bayam, right hand's on the tabla. Dagi na tinaka dina, dagi na tinaka dina. Right. Hold that steady while getting asked a question in mathematics, physics, astronomy, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So concentration means you're holding it all together. Big picture, macro picture, not focusing down on the micro.
Right. And that cannot be achieved through a fragmented education system.
You have to show how everything's related.
Exactly.
Right. And that was the way it used to be in the original university system.
System of ancient days.
Ancient days where there was a connection between India and China and Africa and even Turtle Island too.
Yes, but the thing is, because these were all colonized countries, there's nothing much to learn from that.
There's been a historical erasure of those connections.
But I think what is happening right now in the 21st century is these countries are now slowly beginning to awaken to their inner spirits, their inner strengths. Not in terms of military strength, but in the intrinsic strength of culture, education, and when the spirit is there, now it requires the will. But when those two meet, you're going to see a tremendous outpouring of knowledge base that is coming. And unless we do something very similar over here, American students will be left behind.
So I want you to take heed, American students, or those of you who have American students in your household or you are American students. Something I learned, I've been taking a teacher training course in yoga, and so an African-American man came to our class and talked about, here's what we need to prepare our children for a certain reality. And that is, there are more honor students in China than there are students in America. Okay, and that's your competition.
Right.
Okay, and they're not limiting themselves to learning English. There's multiple languages, multiple fields. Big picture.
Right.
So that if you're going to wait for you and I are educators, and we're trying to slowly change what used to be a very concentrated, focused down colonial education to a wider view. And I have to tell my students, look, you can't depend on the system to teach you what you need to know. You're going to have to do this inside job of expanding your own point of view, self-knowledge, to begin to embrace a larger view.
And the other aspect that is, in terms of discipline within the classroom, you are not entitled to an aide because your physical body is in the class.
Yes. Right.
That is the other part that I find that is slowly slipping away, in the sense of you would never see this in a university in Singapore and Australia and all these places where students are text messaging in a class at a university level.
Right. No, that would not
listening
happen.
to,
or
iPods.
Right.
And
getting A's.
And
Maybe.
But the thing is, at a university, you are there because you want to be there. Now, using my example, I was born very poor. My father was earning $500. He was a clerk in the British Armed Forces. There were 6 of us in the family, my 3 sisters, myself, and my parents. And being poor, my family couldn't even afford uniforms, and it was a hand-me-down from my cousins that I was using, to go to school. When I turned 18 and it was time for me to go do my national service, I decided that I had to get fit because, Army training is pretty rigorous. I did not have enough money to buy shoes, and therefore I was running in the streets of Singapore barefooted, right? Just to get fit for the Army, right? But the thing is, even though we were born poor, there was something that was inculcated within us. My parents, my mother had only grade 2 education. My father had grade 10 education. But it was instilled in us that if you want to get out of poverty, the only way is education. Apply yourself. Yes. Well, you got only one university in Singapore, and at that time 3 million people, so the competition was very tough. And I couldn't get in. But then, by chance, my mother came upon an inheritance, and she could afford to send me over here. But when I came here, the whole issue of, this is the one chance that you're going to get. Apply yourself. So when I look back at myself being poor and now sitting here with a PhD, and I can afford to buy a few of these pants and shirts when there was a time when I couldn't.
Right.
It was because of hard work. The ethics of hard work has got to be inculcated from to the child from the time the child is in kindergarten, all the way through. It is not a case of entitlement. You cannot just sit there and say, "Hand it over to me."
Right. And I'm sorry, Americans. your work ethic compared to the rest of the world who's like hungry and they hustling, you better get on your job quick.
I think I think Thomas Friedman put it very nicely. He says there was once a time when he was a child, his dad would say, "Finish all the food on your plate because people on the other side of the world are starving."
In Asia, right.
Well, right now he has got to tell his daughters, "Finish your homework because people in other part of the world are going to take the jobs away from you, and they are qualified and they will work harder to get that."
Right.
That is what the future is.
For cheaper, you know. And a lot of times.
It might be cheaper in American standards, but in their standards, it's a tremendous.
Great. Yeah.
So the thing is, one has got to be adaptable, one has got to be innovative, one has got to be broad-minded. So you got to look at things from a broad perspective. And basically, that is the part that I feel, standardized testing is not going to help out.
No, not at all.
And so
your child left behind.
Right. So the child must have that ability not to disengage out of fear, but looking at this so-called globalization and say, I want to be a part of that, and not say that, oh, those folks over there, they are stealing the jobs away from me. Well, they are working hard and getting the necessary qualifications to take the job away from you. And these days, jobs don't remain where they are because of technology.
No.
Get prepared for it. Right? You got to go where the jobs are going. And sometimes you might have to go to a so-called developing country to get the same job that you are going to get here. So are you ready?
And can you do that?
Can you do that?
Can you go to another place?
Right.
Because, it might not, they may be speaking English, but they might not be.
Right. I read a report about a year and a half or 2 years ago that appeared in the Eugene Register Guard that 40,000 Indians from India who came here working in Silicon Valley have decided to go back to India.
Yes.
And they gave 3 reasons. One is that they can have, a better quality of life back in India. Second is they do not have to basically, engage in a culture that is foreign to them.
Right.
But the
And
last,
be, in effect, high-tech coolies, as our friend Jason Mack would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but the thing is, the third part, the third reason that they gave that was very interesting was that they could give their children a higher quality of education in their own country than out here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And these people who are
for the
who
reasons
are
that we've been
professionals,
talking about all hour,
Yeah.
you really, because
they are professionals.
Yeah.
They have gone back.
Yeah.
9,000 Chinese have gone back to China because they see more opportunities there. Well, if these people who came here to the land where
Of
everyone
opportunity, the melting pot, right?
Well, the platform,
Yeah.
all right, or the geography of global politics, global economics has changed.
Yes.
Has the education system kept up with it?
No, it has not.
That is the question. And how
And
are
how
we
fast
preparing?
can it adapt?
And how can we prepare our teachers? In other words, the teachers have got to be broad-minded enough to bring in all these various aspects so that they can basically educate the children for the next generation. That is going to be the biggest challenge. I think, in my opinion, the best defense for this country is educate your populace. That is the best defense one can have. It is not on the military might that one really can defend this country. The strength of this nation basically is in its innovativeness.
That's right.
Right? You have got the resources, but it's not being plowed in the right direction.
No.
That is going to be the challenge. Yet to be seen. The election is around the corner. We'll see what happens in the next 4 years.
Personally, I would like to see, a minimum IQ. We're going to have an education president, a minimum IQ test for sitting in the White House. You're going to have to at least be 130 to be president of the United States.
At least.
Final thoughts.
The way from where my life journey has come forth, gone through all my trials and tribulations and my experiences in education, I feel that we are at a moment where it is just a speck in the span of human evolution. I honestly believe that our physical evolution has come to a halt. We're not going to grow an additional appendage or finger or anything. This is how we will be. The next stage of human evolution is in the mind and in the heart. Mm-hmm. And I can see that happening. I can see that happening in the classes that I teach, where students, in 2003 when I was teaching diversity, maybe it took 8th or 9th week before many of the students got it and some of them didn't.
Right.
And as time has gone by, because I teach that class every term, the students are able to get it at the 5th week.
Good.
Last term, it was the 3rd week. And what I mean by getting it is they are willing to examine themselves and basically say, hey, I am biased, I am prejudiced, but knowing this, I will be the link in the chain to break, because I do not want the future, my children or the children of the kids that I talk to be influenced by this.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
If you like what you've seen, email us at live class, DiversiTV, put DiversiTV in the subject, liveclass@lanecc.edu. This has been DiversiTV. I'm Mark Harris. Go well, stay well.